What is story therapy?
Story therapy is something that I developed with the recognition with how psychology and story are so connected. Whether it's the psychology of the writer, the psychology of the protagonist, or the psychology of the audience, it is all about the transformation that happens. So it's therapeutic. So story therapy was a term that came to me with the recognition I knew about narrative therapy. That was something that I studied when I was taking a deep dive into looking at story from all sides. I'm all about the idea of how do we draw from meditation? How do we draw from spiritual books? How do we look at healing books that help writers, that help us also take a deep dive into the psychology of the character through looking at a wound that didn't heal in the past that is creating a block in the present and preventing the character from hitting the dream in the future. So the recognition of this was that through the pursuit, if the pursuit is an opportunity for the character to become aware of the flaw that is holding them back and an opportunity for them to go one step toward healing that earlier wound, then we get how the story is therapy.
Does the viewer also become healed?
It's interesting. We just watched a show by Abby Morgan called The Split on Hulu. And it's interesting that you say that because when I was an executive at Spelling Television, I went through my parents' divorce after 25 years. Then I went through a divorce myself. So I was in this bubble of pain and of hurt. And I remember going to the president of Spelling and saying, we should do a show on divorce. This is something that would help the audience heal. This is something that 50% of the US is going through. And if they're not going through it, then their family is going through it or they know it through their friends. So the audience is massive. And at that point, so many shows dealt with divorce, but they did surface level. And The Split by Abby Morgan takes a much deeper dive into divorce where I felt like being in a committed relationship and watching 3 seasons of The Split was amazing in that it brought up questions for couples to ask each other by showing through the character transformation of what if somebody has a secret that could get in the way of the marriage. And the idea of through a family law firm, you have Hannah, who is a sought after divorce attorney. And then she has 2 sisters and a single mom that raised them. We find in the series arc that the father returns after a 30-year absence. So you have 3 characters who have the same wound. You're going through the main worldview of Hannah, and Hannah has a secret. And this secret could shatter her marriage. And this secret also involves a love triangle, which is another great thing for writers to recognize when we look at love triangles and you see that the love triangle makes the audience die to know what the answer is and to know which direction, which leads from dilemma as well, that the character is going to go in. So yes, I believe that story is therapy that can heal the audience.
And for those of us who are latchkey kids, myself included, watching Kramer versus Kramer
Yes.
as a young person was definitely, probably I was too young to be watching it, but that was one that you could identify with if you were in a situation like that.
And it stayed with you. Like Kramer versus Kramer stayed with you. You forever remembered, like I, in my mind, immediately go to that scene by the toaster where he is unfamiliar in this space with this child and suddenly has to learn something, and you immediately feel the vulnerability, and it helps you understand the transformation. And then when you're in it, that type of pain, which could go into everybody's biggest fear who's ever been in love, is what is the consequence of loving deeply? And that is the idea of the breakup, the idea of the split. And so when you story like Kramer versus Kramer and the split, which was shocking to me that I had never heard about this show, and yet this writer, Abby Morgan, wrote a show called River that I explored that was also brilliant. So when I find shows like these, I love exposing people to them and telling people about them so that they can find them, because it's all about right now, as an audience member, looking for a story that speaks to us, story that we know what the writer is trying to say through the concept and how the central character feels about the concept in terms of the main conflict.
What is the creative concept within a story?
The creative concept could go into the intention of the writer. When you look at things like the external concept, the plot, versus the internal concept having to do with the character transformation and what the character has to learn, and the creative concept of how does one uniquely affect the other. For example, when you look at a show like Ted Lasso, I look at a show like Ted Lasso and I think, oh my gosh, the brilliance of taking a show and grounding it with the idea of two people who have to figure out how to move forward when a marriage doesn't work. And then you add the external plot of a US football coach being brought over to London to coach a Premier League soccer team. Brilliant, because you look at it and you go, story is going to come in. First, you have the agenda of Rebecca, who her motives for bringing Ted Lasso over are more antagonistic. However, seeing the transformation between their dynamic and two people who have parallel life traumas that are going on, and then you add a soccer team where story is coming in, and then you also add an amazing flaw with optimism and the idea of someone who is overly optimistic getting in the way, and then you thrust them into the British audience where this character is considered a wanker because he doesn't have the skill set. And that's where growth happens. So that goes into the idea of a creative concept where the external and the internal are working.